Let me start by saying that I never imagined, at 64 years old, that I would be sitting in a rented sedan outside a luxury high-rise in downtown Houston, waiting to confront a man I'd never met. A man who had been sleeping with my wife. A man who, I would soon discover, had done far worse things than that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Frank Calloway. I spent 32 years as a special agent with the FBI, mostly financial crimes and fraud investigation out of the Atlanta field office. I've dismantled Ponzi schemes, tracked shell companies across 4 continents, and helped put people in federal prison for doing exactly what I was about to discover happening inside my own home. I retired at 61 with a commendation from the director and a mortgage-free house in Sugar Land, Texas, where my wife and I had planned to grow old together. I thought I was done being suspicious of people. I was wrong. It started on a Sunday afternoon in February. My wife, Carol, had been taking pottery classes for about 4 months. She'd picked it up the previous fall, she said, because she'd always wanted a creative outlet, and now that both kids were gone, she had the time. I thought it was wonderful. She came home on Sunday evenings with clay on her forearms and a lightness in her step that I hadn't seen in a while, so I encouraged it. I even helped her set up a small shelf in the garage to display the pieces she brought home. That particular Sunday, she'd left her phone on the kitchen counter. She never left her phone anywhere. It was practically surgically attached to her. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just moving it aside to put down a bag of groceries when the screen lit up with a notification. Can't wait for next week. Miss you already. The contact name was Pottery Studio. I set the phone back down exactly where it had been. I put the groceries away slowly, each item in its right place. Then I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at our backyard, at the oak tree we'd planted the year our son was born, now 31 years tall. I felt the way I used to feel at the start of a complicated case. That cold, clarifying stillness. The part of my brain that spent 3 decades investigating fraud quietly switched on like an engine. Carol came home an hour later, cheerful, clay on her forearms as always. How was class? I asked from the recliner. Wonderful. I'm finally getting the hang of centering. It's all about the pressure you apply. I nodded. Who else goes on Sundays? Oh, the usual group. Linda, Patricia, a couple of younger women. She poured herself a glass of water. You'd find it boring. She was right that I wouldn't find it boring. But not for the reasons she thought. That night, after she fell asleep, I did what I'd spent 3 decades training myself to do. I started building a picture. I logged into our joint bank account, something I almost never did because Carol had handled our household finances for 20 years, and I'd never had a reason to question it. I trusted her completely. In 35 years of marriage, she had never given me a single reason not to. What I found on those bank statements was not a reason. It was an avalanche. Over the previous 8 months, there had been 43 separate transfers. Small ones, mostly. 3,000 here, 7,000 there. Carefully sized to stay below the $10,000 automatic reporting threshold. Combined, they totaled just over $260,000, all transferred to an account I didn't recognize. On top of that, our investment portfolio, which should have been sitting at around $500,000, had been liquidated down to $80,000. The statements showed withdrawal after withdrawal, going back almost a year. I sat in the dark of my home office for a long time. $260,000. The money we'd saved for the last decade of our lives. The money meant to carry us through retirement. Gone. I did not go wake Carol. I did not call her name. I sat there the way I used to sit in the early hours of a surveillance operation, absorbing information, staying controlled. Emotion is a luxury. Evidence is what matters. The next morning, after Carol left for her weekly yoga class, I called my daughter. She's 34, works as a forensic accountant for a firm in Dallas. Out of everyone I know, she was the right person to call. Dad, she answered on the second ring. What's wrong? I've always appreciated that she doesn't waste time with small talk when something is wrong. She got that from me. I need you to look at some financial records and tell me what you see. There was a pause. Dad, what happened? I don't know yet. That's why I need you. I forwarded her the bank statements. While I waited, I pulled up everything I could find about the receiving account number. It traced back to a company called Vertex Capital Partners, LLC, registered in Delaware but operating out of Houston. The managing partner was listed as a man named Kyle Donovan, age 37. My daughter called back within 40 minutes. Dad, this is textbook structuring. Whoever made these transfers was deliberately keeping each one under $10,000 to avoid the bank's automatic flags. This is a federal crime. Her voice was very careful. Do you know whose account this is going to? I'm working on that, Dad. Longer pause. Is this Mom? I didn't answer right away. I don't know the full picture yet. Don't say anything to her. Don't say anything to your brother either. Not yet. Dad, I need to know what I'm dealing with before we talk as a family. She agreed. Reluctantly, but she agreed. I spent the next 2 weeks becoming invisible in my own home. Carol had no idea that while she went to pottery class and yoga and her Tuesday book club, I was using every skill I had spent 3 decades building. I pulled Kyle Donovan's background without hiring anyone. I didn't need to. I still had contacts at the Financial Crimes Division who owed me favors and who could run a search without asking too many questions. What they came back with was not surprising to the investigator in me. It was devastating to the husband. Kyle Donovan had 2 prior investigations, neither resulting in charges due to insufficient evidence. The first was in 2018 inches, Phoenix, involving a 58-year-old married woman who had transferred $190,000 into his company before her husband discovered it during divorce proceedings. The case was dropped when the woman refused to cooperate. The second was in 2021 inches, Nashville. Different woman, mid-50s, divorce proceedings, similar amount, same pattern. The charges never stuck because the transfers had been made voluntarily. On paper, the women had been willing investors in a promising real estate development fund that, predictably, never produced a return. Kyle Donovan found married women in unhappy marriages, made them feel seen and desired, and then guided them toward investment opportunities that funneled their marital assets directly to him. By the time the marriages collapsed, the money was gone, and the women were too humiliated to press charges. I had to sit with that for a while. I thought about the 16 years I'd worked financial fraud cases. I'd interviewed hundreds of victims, smart, capable people who had been manipulated by someone they trusted. Shame was the con artist's greatest weapon, because shame kept victims silent. I wondered how many times Carol had sat across from me at the dinner table, knowing what she was doing, and I had not seen it. I wondered whether she was a willing participant, or whether she had been slowly, carefully worked. I decided I needed to know which one it was before I did anything. The pottery studio she went to on Sundays was real. I confirmed that. She did have a class there, but it ended at 2 in the afternoon, and she never came home before 5. On the 3rd Sunday after I'd started watching, I followed her. She left the studio at 2:07. She drove to a high-rise on Post Oak Boulevard. She used a keycard to enter the parking garage. I noted the building, the time, the floor she went to based on the elevator indicator I could see through the lobby glass. I sat in my car and I waited. She came out at 5:14 with her hair slightly different than when she'd gone in and a particular kind of composure that I recognized. The composure of someone practicing being casual. I drove home separately and was in my recliner with a book when she came in. Good class? I asked. My bowl collapsed. She laughed a little. I think I'm overwetting the clay. I turned a page. These things take practice. That night I made a decision. I was not going to confront Carol. Not yet. I was going to do what I had always done when I had a case that was almost ready but needed one more thing. I was going to close the loop. I called my son the next day. He's 31, finishing his residency at Houston Methodist. We met for lunch at a diner near the medical center. I showed him everything on my laptop. The bank records, the background check on Kyle Donovan, the timeline of transfers. He stared at the screen for a long time without speaking. My son has Carol's face, her dark eyes, her way of going very still when something has shaken him badly. Dad, he finally said, I know. Does she know that you know? No. What are you going to do? I looked at my son. This man I had watched grow from a boy who collected baseball cards to a physician who saved lives. And I told him the truth. I'm going to make sure she doesn't lose everything to this man. And then I'm going to end the marriage and protect what's left. He nodded slowly. I want to help. Not yet. Let me handle one thing first. I called my daughter that evening and told her what I'd confirmed. She had already begun running a quiet financial trace on Vertex Capital Partners. The company had almost no assets. The real estate fund was a shell. There were no properties, no development projects, no returns for any investor. Just a well-designed website and Kyle Donovan's practiced charm. Dad, she said, the money Mom transferred is probably gone. He doesn't keep it in the company accounts. He moves it fast. I know how he does it, I said. I've spent 30 years watching men like him. So what do? I need to talk to him directly first. My daughter went quiet. Why? Because I need to hear what he says when he thinks he's talking to someone who doesn't know anything. And because I need to see him. She tried to talk me out of it. She said to let her contact a lawyer first, to let her build the financial fraud case, to go directly to the authorities. She wasn't wrong, but there was something I needed to do that had nothing to do with evidence. After 35 years, I needed to look at the man my wife had chosen over me and understand what I was dealing with, not as an investigator, as a person. I went to his building on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't use my real name. I told the front desk I was a potential investor referred by a mutual contact and had dropped by on the chance that Mr. Donovan might have a few minutes. Building management called up. Kyle Donovan, to his credit or his greed, said to send me up. He opened the door of his penthouse suite, and I understood immediately. He was everything I was not at that age. Tall, well-built, the kind of effortless looks that age slowly. He had an easy confidence that I recognized from every con artist I had ever put in front of a jury. The specific warmth of a person who has learned to perform warmth so well that they have stopped distinguishing it from the real thing. Come in, he said, extending his hand. Kyle Donovan. And you are? Frank, I said, which was true. I left out the last name. He talked for about 15 minutes about Vertex Capital and their real estate portfolio. He was good. If I hadn't spent 3 decades learning exactly how this kind of presentation worked, I might have found it compelling. About 20 minutes in, I mentioned in a casual way that I'd heard about him through a friend of a friend, a woman in Sugarland. Something moved across his face. Very brief, very controlled, but I was watching for it. Sugarland, he repeated. Sure, I know a few people out that way. Her name's Carol, I said. The pause was less than a second. Carol. He nodded slowly. Yeah, she's a lovely person. We've spoken about investment opportunities. Very sharp. He didn't know who I was. He had no idea he was sitting across from her husband. That was exactly what I needed to confirm. She mentioned you might be someone worth meeting, I said. He smiled. Well, I hope I live up to the recommendation. I stayed 20 minutes more. I asked the right questions, let him keep pitching, and then I thanked him for his time and left. In the elevator going down, I stood alone and breathed slowly the way I used to breathe before I walked into a room to make an arrest. He was exactly what I thought he was. Not a man in love with my wife. A man who had identified my wife as a target and had been systematically converting her affection for him into cash. Carol was not his partner in this. She was his victim. And in trying to escape a marriage she'd apparently been unhappy in for some time, she had walked directly into the hands of someone who knew exactly how to exploit that. That didn't make what she had done to me any less of a betrayal, but it changed the shape of it. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, I asked both kids to come home for dinner. I told them I needed the family together. They came without telling Carol why, which was the only instruction I had given them. Carol made her pot roast. She was happy that night, lighter than she'd been in months. I watched her move around the kitchen, and I thought about the woman I'd married at 29, the woman who'd sat up with me the night our son spiked a fever, and we both thought something was seriously wrong, the woman who'd held my hand at my mother's funeral and hadn't let go for hours. I thought about all of that, and I let myself feel the full weight of it. because I knew that by the end of the evening, none of it would be ours anymore. We sat down to eat. For 20 minutes, we talked about normal things. My son's residency, my daughter's latest project. Carol asked if I'd called my brother, who'd been having health issues. I said I had. Then I put down my fork. Carol, I said, I want to talk about Vertex Capital Partners. The color left her face in the span of one breath. And I want to talk about Kyle Donovan. She looked at our children. They looked back at her quietly. My daughter had her hands folded on the table. Robert, Carol started, and then caught herself. Because my name isn't Robert. Frank. Don't, I said. Not loudly. I didn't need to be loud. I'm going to tell you what I know, and then you're going to listen to something you need to hear. I walked her through it. The transfers, the structuring, the liquidated portfolio, the shell company. I told her about the Phoenix case and the Nashville case, the two women before her who had lost their savings to the same man. I told her about the conversation I'd had with Kyle in his penthouse, how he had no idea who I was, how he had described her as lovely and a potential investor with no more warmth than he might describe a good stock position. She was crying before I finished. Not the kind of crying that is performed, the kind that is simply happening to a person. He said he loved me, she said. I know. He said we were going to. She stopped. She looked at my daughter. Mom. My daughter's voice was careful. His last two investors said the same thing. It's what he does. He finds women who are unhappy, and he makes them feel chosen, and then he takes everything they have and moves on. He didn't tell me it was a fraud, Carol said. I thought it was a real investment. You gave him $260,000 from a joint account without telling me, I said. Whatever you believed about where that money was going, you knew you were hiding it. She pressed her hands over her eyes. I was going to tell you. When the returns came in, I was going to say I'd been investing on my own. And Carol. I said her name the way I used to say a suspect's name when we had reached the part of the conversation where pretending was finished. We don't need to build a story right now. I need you to understand what actually happened so that you can protect yourself from what comes next. She looked at me. The money is almost certainly gone. His company is a shell. He's done this before and he knows how to structure it so it's technically legal, which means you probably have no criminal recourse against him. What you do have is a husband who spent 30 years investigating financial fraud and a daughter who is a forensic accountant. And together, we have been building a documentation file for the past 3 weeks. I slid a folder across the table. This is everything. The wire transfers, his previous investigations, a financial analysis of Vertex Capital. My daughter believes there may be enough here, combined with the Phoenix and Nashville cases, to finally get a federal pattern established. It won't recover your money, but it might prevent him from doing this to someone else. Carol stared at the folder. She didn't open it. Why are you helping me? She asked. Her voice was very small. My son answered before I could. Because you're our mother, he said. Even now, the room was quiet for a moment. I'm filing for divorce, I said. I want you to know that directly from me, not through a lawyer. What happened between us? That's not something I can recover from, but I'm not going to let this man ruin you along with everything else. You're going to cooperate with my daughter on the financial documentation. If we can get a federal case opened, your testimony will be essential. Carol nodded slowly. She looked exhausted in a way that went past the evening. I was unhappy, she said. Not as an excuse. As a fact. I've been unhappy for a long time. I didn't know how to say it. You should have said it. I know. 35 years, Carol. You could have said it any time in 35 years. She didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer. The next 6 months were the most structured and the most fractured of my life simultaneously. Carol moved in with her sister across town. We engaged lawyers, and because there was no prenuptial agreement and Texas is a community property state, my daughter's financial documentation became critical to establishing that the transfers had been made unilaterally without my consent, which complicated Carol's claim to an equal share of what remained. What remained was not much, but it was mine. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Carol kept her personal accounts and a share of the remaining savings. She had to take a part-time bookkeeping job, something she hadn't done since before the kids were born. Kyle Donovan, for his part, had stopped returning her calls 2 weeks after I visited him. By the time she tried to contact him consistently, his cell number was disconnected. Vertex Capital Partners had dissolved. He was simply gone. The way men like him are always simply gone when the transaction is complete. My daughter spent 3 months building the federal documentation file. She connected with the women in Phoenix and Nashville through their attorneys. The Phoenix woman, it turned out, had kept records she'd never had the courage to act on. With 3 victims across 3 states, my daughter's firm and a former colleague of mine at the FBI field office in Houston were able to open a pattern fraud investigation. I do not know whether it will result in charges. These things take time, but the file exists now, and Kyle Donovan's name is in a federal database in a way it wasn't before. That is the closest thing to justice this story contains. I want to be honest about that. People have asked me why I didn't go after him more aggressively, why I didn't show up at his door differently than I did. I understand the impulse, but here is what 32 years of federal law enforcement teaches you. The most effective thing you can do against a con artist is not destruction. It is documentation. Anger closes cases. Evidence opens them. The day I walked into his penthouse suite under a partial name and let him think I was just another potential investor, I confirmed everything I needed to confirm and collected nothing that could be used against me in any proceeding. That mattered. That was how I was trained to think, and I'm grateful for it. My son calls every Sunday. My daughter comes down from Dallas every few weeks, and we sit on the back porch and she updates me on the federal case progress, and we talk about things that have nothing to do with any of this. She has her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and she is going to be extraordinary. The house is quiet in a way that took some adjusting to. Bailey, I don't have a Bailey, but I do have a 12-year-old Labrador named Sargent who was not enthusiastic about the disruption to his routine, has settled back into his habits. We walk in the mornings. I've taken up cycling, which I was resistant to for years and now find essential. About 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into a woman at a cycling event that my son had dragged me to. She was 61, a retired oncologist, widowed 2 years earlier. She had a directness about her that I found immediately refreshing. We talked for an hour about cycling, about Houston's mediocre bike infrastructure, about whether retirement was what either of us had imagined. She did not ask whether I was seeing anyone. She asked what I was working on. I told her about the federal case documentation. She raised her eyebrows. Still working even in retirement. The work follows you, I said. Or, you follow the work. We had dinner the following week. I don't know what that becomes. I'm not in a hurry to know. At 64, starting over is a stranger concept than it was at 30. But it is not, I have found, an impossible one. You build what you can with what you have. You protect your children. You try to do the right thing when the right thing is expensive, and you try not to let bitterness be the price of the lesson. What I know is this. When the person you have loved for 35 years becomes someone you don't recognize, it does something permanent to you. It does not break you if you don't let it, but it changes the structure of how you trust. Not in a way that closes you off, but in a way that makes you more precise, more deliberate. I loved Carol without looking carefully. That was not wisdom. I will not make the same mistake of inattention again. About finances, about the quiet distances that grow in a long marriage, about the small signs that something is wrong. The man who showed up at Kyle Donovan's door did not knock it down. He introduced himself calmly, asked the right questions, and left with what he needed. That is not the satisfying story, I understand. It does not have the confrontation scene that lives in the imagination, but it is the one that ended with my children still speaking to me, with a federal fraud investigation active, and with my name on a house in Sugarland that no one can take from me. My son asked me recently whether I regretted how I handled it, whether I wished I'd done something different. I thought about it seriously before I answered. I regret that I didn't pay closer attention to the marriage long before it reached that point. I regret that Carol felt she couldn't tell me she was unhappy. and I regret that whatever distance had grown between us was large enough for someone like Kyle Donovan to step into. Those are real regrets, and they belong to both of us. I don't regret a single investigative decision I made. I built the case carefully. I protected my assets. I gave my children the information they needed to make their own choices about their mother. And when I sat across from the man who had taken my wife's money and her better judgment, I stayed calm, and I learned what I needed to learn, and I walked away. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is exactly that. Walk away knowing more than the room thinks he does. There's a photo on my office wall from 1998. Carol and I at the Grand Canyon. The kids small beside us. All four of us squinting into the sun. We look like what we were then, a family at the beginning of something long. I haven't taken it down. My daughter asked me why. Given everything, I told her the truth. That man in the photo didn't do anything wrong. And that family at the Grand Canyon was real, even if it didn't survive. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. I'll leave the photo where it is until the day it stops meaning anything. And that day will come when it comes. Right now, I have a Sunday morning ride with a retired oncologist who thinks Houston's bike infrastructure is an embarrassment, a Labrador who needs his walk, and a federal fraud case that I intend to see through to wherever it ends. That's enough. Some days that's more than enough. The man who tried to take everything from me made one mistake that men like him always make. He assumed that the husband was the easy part. He assumed that because Carol had found her way to his door, the door at home was already closed. He didn't ask whether the man on the other side of that closed door had spent 3 decades dismantling the schemes of people exactly like him. He should have asked,